on AAPI Policy Priorities in this Year of Action, hosted by the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans and AAPI Data. My name is Greg Orton. I'm the National Director of NCAPA, and I will be your moderator today. We've got a lot to get into, but before we do, just want to lay out some ground rules and some context. Obviously, we invite everyone to drop their questions in the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'd love to get to as many of those as we can. But in reality, what I want to share is that this survey data that we're about to share is a reflection of our coalition. Our members put their heads together, decided it was important to make sure that the public was aware where the API community stood on a number of really important policy areas that are dominating today's headlines and conversations. And so our first round of survey data went out last fall, and we're very proud of the second round of data that we're releasing today. I will say, as we cover plenty of information, if there is one takeaway to really kind of hone in on, it is that there is a massive disconnect currently with our community and what we believe to be important, what we think our priorities are, and the decisions that are being made in Washington, D.C. I've said this many times in many of our webinars. We're all C3 organizations. We're not in the business of telling people who to vote for or endorsing candidates, but we're absolutely in the business of advocating for our communities. And so as our communities continue to grow, our political power continues to mature, elected officials, the White House, Congress, candidates who are running in this year's midterm elections, ignore this data at your own risk. There's really useful information and is meant to be an invitation to engage with our communities. Now, before I hand it off to Karthik, I want to walk folks through how I plan to move through today. For starters, like I said, I'll invite Karthik Ramakrishnan, the founder and executive director of API Data, to walk us through the survey results. And then we'll spend a few minutes receiving questions from members of the press. From there, I'd like to invite members of NCAPA to provide their expertise to better understand, better contextualize, and better kind of recognize where everything that's happening around us, how it makes sense in relation to the survey data that we're sending out today. And finally, we'd like to answer as many questions from you all as we can. So with the time remaining, we'll try to answer those questions. Karthik, if you're here, I'd like to hand over the virtual mic to you to now walk us through the survey results. Karthik?
Thank you, Greg, and thanks everyone for joining us. I'm thrilled to be with you all today and with the impressive and amazing lineup of NCAPA leaders that we have for much of this program. So let's pull up the slides, please. And before we get into the report itself, one data point from the survey, not as much as, say, for a national audience, although California does represent a little less than 1/3 of the national API population. So I suppose it is relevant nationally as well. But we had a question in the survey that I'll be talking about briefly, focused on California. And the key takeaways to note here is the high proportion of don't knows overall, which is close to a majority, and certainly among API women in California, well over a majority. This was a survey done in late March of 2026. When you combine this along with the fact that we know from community partners that there's been underinvestments in outreach to API communities among the gubernatorial candidates, and the fact that APIs account for 1 of every 5 eligible voters. So that's not a typo. That's close to 20% of the eligible voter population in California. Really gives all of us reason to note the importance of our communities and how political systems, including elected officials or candidates for office, need to take our communities more seriously. Let's go to the next slide, please. So I'll say a little bit about our survey and its goals. Our goals were to get a sense of issue prioritization and any changes since last year. 2, to gain a deeper understanding of community opinion, to go beyond just a superficial level understanding on an issue like immigration, say, or healthcare. And then finally, to have this data and this evidence inform outreach strategies among our community partners, as well as with in terms of relationships we have in government, to ensure greater community awareness and policy responsiveness for a critical year of action. You'll be hearing later on from Nguyen from OCA, who's a co-chair of the Strategic Narrative Working Group. And the year of action is not only a hashtag, but a mindset and determination that all of us have for this consequential year. Let's go to the next slide. So here's a quick take on the methods of the survey and the overall margin of error. We're pleased to have a larger sample size of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders than usual. So we have more confidence in the data on NHPIs that are released in this survey. Let's go to the next slide. So what are the key points here? One, if there's one thing that you take away from this is that affordability remains a dominant issue. So 58% cite that as the top issue. The number three issue is jobs in the economy. Put that together, this the economy that's remains dominant as we saw in 2025. War and foreign policy has shot up to number two. But if you see through other data, including on congressional spending priorities, it all that also comes back to the economy. Essentially, APIs think we're spending too much on military and on immigration enforcement and not enough on healthcare and education. When it comes to healthcare, we asked about specific policies, and I'll go into that in more detail later. Next slide. We also asked about rights and freedoms under threat, and we found that freedom of speech is viewed as a most threatened right, and that this is across the board, including among API Republicans. This is an area of serious concern. We also asked a few questions about artificial intelligence, and they're preventing racial bias and also making sure that AI is not used for making final medical decisions and educational placement decisions are all significant priorities in our community. Finally, when it comes to the parties, APIs trust Democrats more than Republicans on most issues, but they're still persuadable. There's a fair number who say neither or don't know who they trust more on a particular issue. And then finally, Republicans hold an advantage on crime and public safety, although this is a lower priority issue and less so than we found last year. Next slide. So top issues and party trust. Let's go to the next slide. So cost of living, as I mentioned, and jobs in the economy, two out of the top three. And it's clearly cost of living inflation is clearly the number one. War and foreign policy is number two. The way this question was worded, people could select up to three issues. That's why the results add up to well over 100. But it does force people to have to prioritize among a list of options. Next slide. So when it comes to WARN US foreign policy, by the way, if you go to our website or NCAPA's website, you will see the disaggregated results, disaggregated not only by race and ethnicity, but also by gender, age, and party identification. So some interesting patterns emerge here. In terms of WARN US foreign policy, you see independence ranking that as a very high area of concern. And interestingly, right, it's not just a young people's issue. Those aged 50 to 64 as well as 65 plus rank it as a very high issue. Next slide. In terms of which party they trust to do a better job on these key issues, remember kind of what those top issues are. So even though cost of living is near the bottom here, what that tells you is that the Democratic to Republican advantage is not as high, although it's still there, 36 to 14. You have a fair number of people who are saying neither, right? 29%. But that is the number one issue in terms of priority. So hopefully people can use these different results together to weave not only a narrative, but to have an understanding that pulls on multiple data points. On issues like healthcare, hate crimes, racial discrimination, and education, the advantage is very, very strong, and it's strong across the board, except for crime and public safety, which is not only at the bottom in terms of which party is seen as having more advantage, but also near the bottom when it comes to priorities in our community. Next slide. In terms of government spending priorities, let's go to the next slide. We asked not only about what programs people think there should be more or less spending on, but also this general question about the size of government. This is a classic question in the political science literature and public opinion literature. Essentially, do people want a bigger government, pay more taxes to provide more services? And the answer is in our community is a resounding yes. It's about a 2/3 to 1/3 ratio. And this, by the way, has remained consistent for more than a decade. We asked this in 2012, and we found a very similar pattern, and other surveys find similar patterns. there is some interesting ethnic variation. And some of the surprise might be among Filipinos who, among API groups, tend to lean a bit more conservative. They too want government to do more. Next slide. In terms of other differences, predictably, Democrats, more so than Republicans, want to see bigger government, and independents are in between. Surprisingly, on those age 65 plus, we see more of an even split. And that is surprising because many people age 65 plus benefit from government programs. So it's perhaps they're thinking about other government services other than those that they benefit from. Next slide. In terms of particular programs, we see that our community thinks that the US government is spending too much on immigration enforcement and on military defense, and too little on healthcare and education. Unfortunately, this is the reverse of what the current administration's proposed budget is, with a massive increase in military defense, continued spending on immigration enforcement, and significant cuts on social services and on other matters like healthcare and education. Next slide. We see some important differences here by ethnicity that I'll just let you marinate it on. This slide deck, by the way, will be available on our website, but you can look at all the gory details of the disaggregated results by downloading our appendix. Next slide. We also see some important differences by party ID in terms of spending on education. Importantly, when it comes to spending on education and age, you see that across the board. So it's not just those 18 to 34, but also those 65 plus think that the government is spending too little on education. Let's go to the next slide. Similar patterns on healthcare, we find across the board, our communities believe that the government's spending too little on healthcare, but the ordering is a little bit different on the ethnic groups on this measure as for other measures. Next slide. Okay, so on immigration enforcement, a few findings. One is we have repeated a question on deporting all immigrants living in the country illegally over several surveys. So it's not just the Policy Priorities Survey, but also in our survey partnership with the Associated Press and NORC. And what you'll see is that from December 2024, where the community was evenly split on favor and oppose, you see a clear separation, increase in opposition and a decrease in support. And it's likely that the major enforcement actions in Los Angeles and Chicago last year, as well as the more recent actions in Minneapolis, have played a considerable role, not necessarily because people have direct ties to communities there, but also because of the media coverage that has been generated, both in mainstream media as well as in ethnic media. Next slide. We see continued opposition to many tactics like conducting large-scale immigration raids, allowing immigration enforcement agents to wear full face masks, as well as conducting immigration enforcement in places like sensitive locales like schools and hospitals. On the flip side, we see very strong support. So 80% support requiring immigration enforcement agents to wear body cameras. This is a key demand that Senate Democrats have been holding up in terms of the reauthorization of Homeland Security in terms of the budget. Next slide. In terms of deportations, not only did we repeat the question in terms of the generic question, we asked about other items, and where I draw your attention to here is the item on eliminating ICE. So this is the first time we have survey data on where our community stands on this issue. And we see that for some populations, if you look at the detailed results, for example, among those 18 to 34, it approaches a majority. The community is split on this, but more favor eliminating ICE than oppose eliminating ICE. Next slide. On healthcare. So reminder, healthcare is a big concern, with nearly 1 in 3 respondents mentioning it as one of the most important problems facing the country. What they want is they want to lower the cost of prescription drugs, also increase support for disease research funding, Also increased support for healthcare for low-income residents, as well as funding for youth mental health. So on the next slide, you'll see the data points related to these findings, and we'll hear more from our speakers on education, healthcare, and more. Next slide. In terms of restoring federal programs, just for a bit of context, this administration has eliminated funding for minority serving institutions. It has also prevented immigrants, including green card holders, to apply for small business loans from the federal government. The administration has also dramatically deprioritized language access, both through executive order as well as guidance from the Department of Justice. And then finally, they've eliminated the White House initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. We see that on many of these, actually back to the previous slide, we see it is a very high priority for our community to restore these measures, except for the White House initiative on APIs, likely because you see fundamental distrust across data points in this survey as well as past surveys for this administration. Next slide. So in terms of restoring funding for colleges and universities with low-income API students, you see support and high prioritization across the board by age, and a decently amount by party ID as well, right? That party skew. So even API Republicans, 35% say it's either a high priority or a very high priority. Let's go to the next slide. In terms of language assistance, we see some variation across the board. Vietnamese Americans, very high priority, perhaps not surprising, given limited English proficiency. Not as high among Korean and Chinese Americans, who also have relatively low English proficiency compared to the average for Asian Americans, and the lowest priority among Japanese Americans and Indian Americans, who tend to have high levels of English proficiency. Next slide. By the way, the quick thing I'll note on language proficiency is that those findings point to the need for ongoing community engagement on why this is an important matter. We also asked about rights and freedoms that are under threat. We find that freedom of speech is the most threatened, following by various other rights and freedoms that are under threat, including the freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, right to privacy, freedom of press, and the right to assemble and protest peacefully, as well as the right to vote. So even though you see a difference of 30% to 38% in that range, they're all largely within the survey's margin of error, right? So those would all cluster as similar levels. And then finally, freedom of religion and the right to keep and bear arms are much lower in terms of being perceived as a threat, under threat. Next slide. You see some variation here by age. You see those age 18 to 34 and those 65 plus. Having similar positions in terms of how grave a threat they see in terms of freedom of speech. I was not expecting that to see it among those age 65 plus. Importantly, on party ID, API Republicans, 45% see this as under threat, 52% of independents. So it's not always a party ID issue when it comes to some of these questions and the results that we see. Next slide. In terms of freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, we see some interesting patterns by age that people will probably want to dissect and figure out what's going on. Interestingly, women much more than men, seeing this as under threat. And Democrats and independents largely on the same page when it comes to seeing the freedom from unreasonable search and seizure as facing significant threat right now. Next slide. In terms of data privacy and census concerns, just for context, API Data and NCAPA, including members of the Data Equity Working Group, have been working on data security and data privacy as an important area of concern. You can check out our report, which is the Safety First report on API Data's website under reports. And we asked questions specific to census data as well as other data. So let's go to the next slide. So we see significant concerns when it comes to the federal government potentially sharing tax data with other government agencies, as well as health data with other government agencies. We also see an increase in the proportion since when the Census Bureau asked it in 2018 that census data could harm people, both in terms of information being used against you, as well as in a subsequent question on the next slide. So let's go to that next slide. So whether the census will benefit or harm the community, we see an alarming increase from 2018. Remember, that was the first Trump administration. Only 1% back then said that the Census Bureau's data might harm the community. Now we have 7% saying that. In terms of those saying both benefit and harm, that's 30%. So when you add the 7 to the 30, 37% think there's some potential harm here from participating in the census. Census 2030 is just a few years away, and this should be a flashing warning sign in terms of our community potentially being undercounted because community members sees potential harms coming from that. Next slide. Finally, policies on artificial intelligence. Let's just go to the next slide in the interest of time. When it comes to making final medical decisions, California actually passed a law that took effect in 2025 that ensures that the final decision maker on medical decisions is a human. This is something that other states could pursue and Congress could pursue as well. We asked a similar question about educational placement decisions, and we found similarly that people would consider it a very high priority or high priority to make sure that humans are in charge when it comes to placement decisions. We also see very strong prioritization on making sure that there's easy to understand language when it comes to AI tools and their privacy policies, as well as preventing racial bias in decisions made by AI technology. Next slide. In terms of next steps, we want to make sure that these data don't just remain on your downloads folder. At API Data, we have our framework of data, narrative, and action, and we are so heartened by our partnership with NCAPA and its 46 member organizations to make sure that we take these insights and use it to inform strategic action. So in addition to these surveys, the 2025 and 2026 API Policy Priorities Survey, we also encourage you to check out NCAPA's resources on their page, as well as our resource guides at AAPI Data. So with that, I will open it up to any clarifying questions that folks have. Let me just take a look at the Q&A. Okay, so some folks asked about for NHPI communities. You will find that in our appendix. They were there in many of these slides. It's difficult to disaggregate within the NHPI community given sample size, but we do have the NHPI community breakout for all of the questions. Does national debt come up as an issue? We have not asked specifically about national debt, and it's not something that we typically see in other surveys as well as an issue that is of high priority for not only API communities, but outside. In terms of foreign-born versus native-born, I believe we do have that in our appendix. So please check out the appendix, and happy to come back later in the Q&A, but I'll go do some additional research in the meantime. If there is a member of the press that has a pressing matter or concern that they would like to ask, please type it in the Q&A, and I or other members of the team will respond by typing in the answer. So with that, I'll kick it back to Greg.
Thanks, Karthik. And thanks everyone for the questions. Encourage everyone to continue dropping them. We will answer them as best we can as we go. But as promised, I'd like to shift gears a little bit and invite members of our coalition to come in and provide their own takes and interpretations on this survey data. So starting with Sina Wipi from Empowering Pacific Islander Communities. Obviously, the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander community has not been immune to the sort of massive cuts that we've seen in federal spending across the board. And Sina, I want to recognize as someone who continues to bring up the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander community, ensures that our collective analysis includes them more and more. And so, Sina, I'd love to get your take. How do you interpret this survey data? How does it connect with what you're seeing in your own community? Help us make sense of all of that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Greg. Aloha Lele and hello everyone. I want to acknowledge the Indigenous and Anacostan and Piscataway lands I'm on. As Greg said, my name is Sina Weepy and I serve as the Director of Policy and Advocacy for Empowering Pacific Islander Communities. There's so many interpretations, right, when it comes to affordability. There are 1.6 million Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders in the US, one of the fastest growing communities in the country. Our families, our elders, workers, and veterans have contributed to this country too. And right now, our communities are concerned about whether or not they can afford to eat, stay housed, access healthcare, and keep their jobs. I'm going to start with climate change because displacement is an affordability crisis, and that's where it starts for many NHPI communities. It increases insurance, destroys crops, contaminates water, forces migration into cities where the safety net is being cut simultaneously. Just within the last month, Hawaii experienced severe flooding, and the Northern Mariana Islands was impacted by Typhoon Sinlaku. Federal cuts to FEMA, NOAA, and climate resilience programs removed the latest buffers for island and coastal communities already losing ground. When your island flood, you don't just lose your home, you lose your homeland. For housing, over 50% of Native Hawaiians live outside of Hawaii, driven out by unaffordability. HUD cuts and rollbacks remove the last safety net for families already in crisis. When you can't afford to stay in your homeland, it's not a housing problem, it's a systemic one. When it comes to health, NHPI communities have disproportionately high rates of diabetes, high blood pressure, and cancer. Medicaid helps to keep those conditions from becoming emergencies. Cutting coverage doesn't eliminate the cost. The onus is then put onto families who can barely afford it, which can lead to emergency rooms, debt, and early death. When an elder skips medication because there's no coverage, a manageable condition becomes a crisis. These cuts make prevention impossible. As far as food insecurity, 1 in 4 NHPIs receive SNAP benefits, and households are multi-generational. A SNAP cut doesn't just affect one person, it affects everyone in the home. Feeding everyone at the table is not a preference in our culture, it's an obligation. These cuts force impossible choices between rent and food. For COFA migrants, new federal eligibility reinterpretations threaten access to Head Start and community health programs. Though court injunctions have temporarily blocked these restrictions in many states, the fight is ongoing. For COFA nations, signed compacts granting their citizens the right to live and work in the US in exchange for decades of military use of their lands, including nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands. COFA migrants also received full federal benefit eligibility in March of 2024 and had it partially rolled back within 16 months, with further restrictions currently blocked in court. This is a broken federal promise, landing hardest on some of the most medically vulnerable Pacific Islander communities in the country, who are still bearing the health consequences of US nuclear testing. The United States tested nuclear weapons on Marshallese land, displaced their communities, and promised care in return. Cutting access to healthcare and food is not fiscal policy, it's a broken promise. These crises are not separate, they compound each other, and they all have one thing in common. They are decided by the people we elect. Climate displacement forces migration into a system that has already cut the programs to receive them and leave our ancestral homes unprotected. Low wages make housing unaffordable. Unaffordable housing leads to overcrowding and poor health outcomes. Medicaid cuts leave chronic conditions untreated. SNAP cuts mean families go hungry trying to make rent. And COFA cuts break a formal federal promise to people who've been displaced. Our communities have survived colonization, migration, and a pandemic. We are resilient, but resilience is not a substitute for justice. We're asking for what was promised. With that said, I implore everyone here to know your rights, to register to vote, demand disaggregated data, hold lawmakers accountable, and insist that our stories be told on our own terms. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you, Sina, and thank you for your comments. I'd like to stay on this topic of affordability and opportunity and invite Mike Hua-Win, who is a associate professor of education at UCLA and representing Asian Pacific Americans in higher education to break it down for us, shifting gears to higher ed. Obviously, our community cares deeply about education. That's captured in the survey data. Mike, help us understand what's really been going on in terms of federal policy decisions and how it's trickling down and having a real impact on higher ed institutions.
Thanks so much, Greg, and good afternoon, everyone. And also, let me also thank Karthik and the AAPI Data team, as well as the NCAPA team for hosting today's really important webinar. So, my name is Mike Huang, and I serve on the board of directors for Asian and Pacific Americans in higher education, better known as AAPI. And my day job, I'm a professor of an associate professor of education at UCLA. And so, as Greg mentioned, I'm here to speak on the survey and the results and the findings regarding education. And the data and the results really confirm important issues facing our communities, right? And that education remains a major and top priority for AAPIs. As Karthik showed in his slides, the results show that 70% of AAPIs believe that our government is spending far too little on education. It speaks to systemic issues impacting our long-term funding models, as well as the current slashing of educational programs that we are seeing unfold in real time. The actions by the administration, including the move to dismantle the U.S. Department of Education and move programs to other agencies, directly threaten the stability of our schools and the educational trajectories of our students. So when we talk about defunding education, we're talking about the removal of one of the most important priorities for our communities, as the survey demonstrated. An example of this type of defunding in action is the administration's recent efforts to unilaterally abolish AAPIs. That is Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander serving institutions, as well as all other minority serving institutions. And this is really an attempt to erase the specific needs of our students, right? AAPIs are the backbone of American higher education for our AAPI students. They comprise of only 7% of all colleges and universities in the country, but they enroll nearly half of all AAPI undergraduate students. And so we really cannot allow the progress made to serve our institutions from AAPIs to be undone by executive branch overreach. So I guess what I'm trying to say, in other words, is the administration cannot unilaterally override a congressionally established program that is codified in federal statute. They simply just do not have that authority. Instead, they must do what every Department of Education has done, which is to faithfully administer this federal education program, as well as all educational programs as Congress has intended and as Congress has funded. Education is the bedrock of our community's future. And as the data shows, our community is ready to organize, advocate, and fight for it. So thanks so much for the opportunity to share a little bit about the needs of our communities with respect to education. I look forward to the questions in the conversation.
Thank you, Mike. So I'd like to now kind of turn our attention to this theme of rights and freedoms. It's reflected in the data questions as well. And obviously there's been a lot going on. And a few months ago, we were talking about immigration raids. We're talking about the war in Iran now. We're always talking about affordability. But one thing that's always struck me is in this conversation about immigration enforcement, immigrant rights, it feels like the national discourse has been reduced to demonizing immigrants or trying to advocate for them and recognizing the harm and just tremendous disruption that the federal government has had on so many different immigrant communities. So I'd like to invite Kham Mua, who is the National Deputy Director of CRAC, to provide some context. Kham and his organization have been on the front lines of advocating for Southeast Asian Americans and obviously recognizing the impact that immigration enforcement has had on the community. I'd love, Kham, to hear from you, just to remind folks that there are real people involved in this and the impact and the harm runs very deep. So Kham, break it down for us.
Yeah, Greg, I really appreciate you all and AAPI Data for inviting us to be part of this conversation. I think the data results are not surprising at all. I think we've seen that immigration and customs enforcement and customs and border protection have been terrorizing our communities for over a year and a half at this point. For Southeast Asian American communities, we know that under this administration, over 60% of all Laotians, Hmong, and folks from Laos who've ever been deported since 1998 has occurred between 2025 and 2026. 50% for Vietnamese folks who've been deported since 1998. This administration has done so much damage to those communities, including mass raids of our communities, going after undocumented populations, going after anyone who looks like they might be an immigrant, and quite frankly, expanding the definition of what criminality looks like and who they can try to remove or go after for minor convictions or crimes. And, I think the data shows us that, Asian Americans, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders are tired of that. I think there are, when we see that more people oppose deporting lawful permanent residents who have minor convictions than those who oppose it, when we see that more Asian Americans and Native Hawaiians feel that it should be eliminated, it shows us that our communities believe that we need more oversight and more limitations on what customs enforcement, border protection, and immigration and customs enforcement can do in our communities. I think Minnesota and what we saw in Minneapolis and in St. Paul was a flashpoint for our communities. We saw immigration and customs enforcement go door to door looking for Hmong and other Asian American families. We saw that they basically trampled on the rights of our communities, regardless of their immigration status, racial profiling, the people in our families in our neighborhoods. We saw them ignore due process protections, violate our communities, and be violent with them when they dragged them out of their houses in the middle of the night or left them, outside detention centers in Houston, about hundreds of miles away from their home with no one to pick them up. And, I think we're sick of it. I think that's why, we've seen Congress still, um, have difficulty even funding, the Department of Homeland Security right now because of conversations around how do we, navigate immigration and customs enforcement and customs and border patrol. I think anything that Congress might do to try to fund those two agencies flies in the face of what our communities have been experiencing, what the data shows. And I think, Americans are feeling like we need to see a change. It's why, in order to fund those two rogue agencies, the Senate and House has had to even consider reconciliation and bypass the formal congressional processes, because we know that the American public just doesn't support those two agencies in the same way anymore. And so I think, there are a number of things that the data shows. I think Asian Americans, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders feel very similar to the broader American public. But I think, it also makes a new argument for why we need new legislation that puts into place limitations on who customs enforcement, on who ICE can go after, and pulls back the ability of those two agencies to really, be used as as the private arm of the presidency. I think efforts like the Southeast Asian Deportation Relief Act to limit the ways that we are able to deport refugee populations from Southeast Asia, or bills like the New Way Forward Act, which places limitations on how we look at enforcement for customs and border protection, and putting in place processes to look at people who've been deported. Those are policies that should be considered in light of this new data. So thank you, and appreciate the opportunity to speak.
Thanks, Com. I'd like to go next to Tu Nguyen, the Executive Director of OCA National. And the reason we wanted to have OCA come in and share their perspective on this question around rights and freedoms is OCA is one of our legacy members, right? OCA, JCL are two of the longest standing Asian American civil rights organizations in the country. Oftentimes, the work that we're doing today wouldn't be possible without the progress that they allowed to happen over the last few decades. And so OCA's members often are folks who've been doing this work for a very long time, but also recognizing that under Tu's leadership, they've done a really great job of engaging with youth too. And so I think Tu is in this very unique position to provide perspective on this question around rights and freedoms and what we're doing this year and everything that's going on between those two ends of the spectrum. So Tu, let us know what you're thinking.
Yeah, I think I want to talk to two fundamental freedoms that are under blatant attack right now. And that's the freedom of speech, First Amendment rights, and our freedom to vote. And for many of our community members, and there's many reasons why our community members are here today, and have immigrated here, but among those top two reasons are the freedom of speech here in the United States of America and our political power and the ability to cast a vote and vote for our elected officials, and have a say in legislation that impacts us, right? Through the elected officials that we vote for, lawmakers that we vote for. And so, first of all, we've started to see at the beginning of last year, or even late 2023, but um, increasingly so through last year and now, is the attacks on freedom of speech. On college campuses, we've seen students' freedoms of speech under attack. Uh, most of our movements that we have known have started with youth-led movements on college campuses. And so it is critical that our university and college leaders protect our students' ability to speak freely. It is important for our community leaders to rally around our youth's freedom of speech on college campuses. And not only that, we're seeing the administration's blatant attacks on freedom of speech through the Federal Communications Commission. OCA has been speaking out really with the Hispanic, Black, and other organizations on preventing conglomerate media mergers, right? This administration is allowing a single entity to control up to 80% of American TV viewership. We are basically pipelining into essentially what could end up being a state media, right? That propels what propaganda that is coming out of certain outlets and certain viewpoints. Our American TV viewers won't be able to have diversity of content. They won't be able to get local media and news reporting about their own community. And we really need to put a stop to this. So we really applaud the state attorney generals who filed a lawsuit against Nexstar Tegna merger. And we continue to push back against the FCC's ability at, well, trying to leverage their really overstepping their ability to allow such conglomerates to happen. And then we just saw yesterday their attack, frankly, on Disney by this is an unprecedented ask to review their license renewals. This is a continued assault on broadcast media and freedom of speech. And we really hope that there's like legal challenges to this, and we continue to speak up against and try to hold Congress to get Congress to hold the FCC accountable to upholding laws that have already been placed to protect free speech and broadcast media. And then second is the attacks on our freedom to vote, and we just saw that earlier today. Everybody's been talking about the Supreme Court case. The attacks on our voting rights is blatant as well. And in addition to OCA's lawsuits on the president's executive order about both the one last year about voter IDs, and then the one this year about mail-in voting that was issued earlier this month, we continue to really be vigilant about protecting our voters' ability to go vote at the polls this November. So OCA's been basically training up. We're working with ALDEF and API Vote, making sure that all of our constituents are trained up to do poll monitoring, to support on the API voter hotline, and to continue to do outreach and engagement, because it is so critical that we turn out our community to vote this November. And OCA has also been partnering with a number of orgs and Senator Murphy and Representative Ruiz on the Vote Without Fear Act, because we don't want private citizens bringing firearms to the polls and intimidating our voters as well. And this is a bipartisan issue. We don't want voter intimidation for anyone. We want everybody to be able to go out and vote at the polls. And so it's really concerning, and we're glad to see that the data shows the API community is paying attention to the attacks on our freedom of speech and our freedom to vote. We need to continue keeping the spotlight on those two issues, and we need to turn out at the polls as well.
Thanks, too. Last question on rights and freedoms. I want to invite Kelvin Lum, who's the Director of Federal Policy for Stop API Hate, to share his thoughts. Obviously, everyone knows Stop API Hate when they emerged during the COVID-19 pandemic and was a leading voice in helping really shine a light on what was happening to our community across the country. Since then, Stop API Hate has become a fixture in the coalition's broader civil rights work. Kelvin's been a tremendous addition to that work, and I'd love to hear his perspective on this question of like how is Stop API Hate tackling and interpreting both the survey data, but also everything that's happening around us when it comes to constitutional rights and freedoms that are under attack.
Thanks, Greg. As we all know, for the API community, which is the only majority foreign-born racial group, it's hard to separate threats against immigration status, whether it's threats on denaturalization or attacks on H-1B holders, from the broader threats on constitutional rights and freedoms because it hits so close to home. Two policies I wanted to highlight that are in the survey and bring some context on how Stop API Hate work aligns with those findings. The first survey result is in regards to increasing concerns about APIs on threats to their personal autonomy and constitutional rights. Freedom of speech was listed in the survey as the most threatened right, with nearly half of APIs viewing their First Amendment right at threat. And the right to privacy and the right to peacefully assemble are in the top five as well, with more than 30%. The growing concern about the threat of constitutional rights is something that our work bears out. As part of our third annual State of Hate survey that we'll be releasing next week fully, we asked a set of questions related to the impact of Trump's anti-immigrant agenda. Our survey found that half of API adults in the US said that they or another person in their community, whether that's friends, family, or coworkers, were impacted by anti-immigrant policies or sentiment in the past year. As a result, 45% of APIs feel less secure in the US and 39% report withdrawing from public life. Results that are in line with the survey by API Data that the real fears that our communities are facing. Drilling down more into the threat of freedom of speech, concerns over immigration enforcement is going beyond just the fear of these rights being taken away. Our community members are actually changing their daily habits because of it. According to our survey, 1/4 of respondents said that they or an individual they personally know changed their social media presence, while a similar number became less civically or politically active. Over the last year plus, Stop API 8 has been working to make the case that anti-immigrant hate is a form of anti-Asian hate and continuing the drumbeat on the rise of anti-immigrant policies. We're really seeing a trifecta of anti-Asian hate playing out, from hate acts, rhetoric, and now the rise of policies that are targeting our communities that only fuel dangerous rhetoric and continue high levels of hate acts. The second survey result I wanted to touch on was regarding the vast disparity of survey respondents who believe the government is spending too much on immigration enforcement. This result is no surprise given Trump's aggressive detention and deportation campaign, and our research has found the clear impact of ICE's terror tactics on our community. From data Stop API Hate analyzed comparing ICE activities involving Asian Pacific Islander people during this administration, we've seen that arrests, detentions, and deportation of our people, have all increased significantly compared to a similar time range under the previous administration. We're talking about 5 times the number of arrests, 6 times the number of detentions, and 7 times the number of deportations. In addition, despite Trump's claims to deport the worst of the worst, most detentions are not connected to a criminal conviction. 68% of those detentions had no conviction, which is 9 times higher than the previous administration. As previously mentioned, it's particularly concerning that despite the broad opposition to massive spending increases in immigration enforcement, Trump and Congress want to double down on this strategy and provide tens of billions more in funding to use the same partisan budget process, which gave $170 billion to ICE and CBP last year, paid for by cuts to healthcare and food assistance. Based on today's survey results, that is notable because those are cuts that come to critical programs that actually address the concerns of APIs, which are affordability and cost of living. I want to thank NCAPA and API Data for this important survey work and for including us as part of this great panel of speakers. Thanks so much, Greg.
Thanks, Kelvin. So to close us out, I want to talk about well-being and belonging, right, in this country. It's obviously we could talk about policy all day. We are aware of the impacts. We can get into the weeds of what policy decisions and regulations are having. But the truth is, for every single person on this webinar, you feel it, right? You take it home, even if you're working on it every single day. It's brought home in a way, it's internalized. And so we have to talk about mental health, right? We have to recognize that everything that's happening around us continues to have impact. Everyone internalizes it differently, but it still ultimately has that impact. And so who better to talk about this than Crystal Canare, who is the Interim Executive Director of the National Asian American Pacific Islander Mental Health Association. Crystal, I'd love to invite you to speak for a few minutes and talk about that connection of mental health impact and everything that's happening around affordability, program cuts, attacks on rights. So, Crystal, please go ahead.
Absolutely. Thanks, Greg. Thank you, Greg and Kappa API Data for having this conversation and inviting the PIMA. So good afternoon, everyone. Magandang umaga at hapon sa inyong lahat. My name is Crystal Canari, and yes, we'll be closing us out today on this final pillar of connection and well-being. So a little bit about NCAPA. We initially formed through seed funding through the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services in 2001. And afterwards, we thought very quickly it was important to create a nonprofit to be able to do this work, to promote mental health and well-being in our communities through both trainings, community programs, and also national policy and advocacy. And so as Greg suggested, just said, everything that was talked about in these last 30 minutes, all the challenges, all the priorities that were mentioned in the survey, they all impact our community's mental health. What attacks our communities threatens our safety and well-being, right? And as the survey suggests, we have seen historic funding cuts to Medicaid. We've seen rising insurance and price hikes related to prescription drugs. We've seen a series of executive orders and policies just disproportionately impacting our communities, such as the HHS ban that bans undocumented immigrants from many federal and social programs. As a result, NCAPA and our community partners have really been impacted. We've seen many programs cut across all of our agencies. We've seen immigrant and refugee communities not being able to seek the services that they need, and also research that is no longer being done. For example, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, which we've used for years to be able to understand how NHPIs are accessing mental health resources and services, it no longer disaggregates by race and ethnicity. And so we're really trying to figure out ways in which we can fill that void. And with our community partners, even in real time today, I had spoken to a community partner, and they have continued to feel the cuts of their programs where they're either needing to sunset or have to cut half their programs in order to continue and stay afloat. And so what does that impact on our people? Well, the national data remains consistent. Again, we know NHPIs are the least likely to utilize mental health services, and suicide is the leading cause of death for NHPI youth and young adults. And so the affordability crisis compounds that. We're already seeing, in addition to the mental health stigma that exists in our community, we're already seeing in our community partners organizations that folks are not showing up. There is a mistrust in how their information will now be shared. And given, the affordability, the programs that they have standing programs that they've used are no longer there, there's this overall freezing in the community. And so what we know when it comes to mental health is if you don't seek those services early, those outcomes of health and well-being will worsen. And so we are definitely going to notice in future years, that impact of delay in seeking the mental health services and supports that folks may need. And so as we talk about community connection and well-being at this time, I would just say that the way we continue to foster that connection and belonging is to support the things that combat hate and violence in our communities. Within our work with CAPAC, we are doing National NHPI Mental Health Day next month on May 10th, and we are also working to pass legislation on the Stop Mental Health Stigma in Our Communities Act, which will increase funding towards mental health resources. And through our former funding through the White House Initiative on NHPIs, which we received during the Biden administration, we formed a national collaborative on achieving whole health, which helps to bring together all these community organizations that may be impacted at this time. And so just want to kind of close out and say, it's so important to serve our communities, support ourselves. And so may everyone's, obstacles be removed on our journeys as we continue to do this hard work, and also take care of yourselves. We can only do this as we take care of ourselves so that we can also lead for the long haul. So thank you all.
Thank you, Crystal. And now I'd like to get get through the questions that have been posed by the audience. It is not too late, so go ahead and if you still have a pressing question, drop it in the Q&A function. I think in the interest of fairness, we'll just take this in the order that they were received. Maybe we can combine the first two questions. It kind of revolves around this question of the direct relationship of the work that we're doing, how is it related to Congress and decision makers, but also, Karthik, you mentioned you wanted to take a stab at this. Do we see a relationship between the policies that are being promulgated in DC and how our community actually interprets them and affects them, such as the Supreme Court ruling today?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So many of us, certainly I would say if we did a poll of most people on this call, you're probably paying attention to the news that's happening, not only every week, but even potentially by the day, and are connecting the dots. If you look at most of our community, they are struggling economically. They do not have the luxury or the time or the bandwidth to pay attention to what's going on. But their friends and family members are being affected, or they may catch snippets in the news here or there. Something needs to rise to a level of being in the news every day for it to fully sink in. This is where groups like NCAPA and NCAPA member organizations come in. They are the policy nerds who are paying attention to what is happening every day and trying the best of their ability to make sure that their community partners around the country know that there are folks in DC who are fighting the good fight and making sure that our community is not being ignored. And that's for API data. I mean, we know that we can bring as much survey and data expertise as possible, and even strategy when it comes to narrative work. We don't have the muscle. We don't have the relationships the way that many NCAPA organizations and NCAPA staff do. So that's the beauty of the partnership that I see, is that it is evidence informed. I think one of the key things, Greg and others, is that people were surprised a bit by some of the dynamics they saw in 2024. Remember, on deportations, favor and oppose in December 2024 was neck and neck. That is something that we had not seen a decade ago. So that's another reason why we need to do the both and. It's not just advocacy, but to pay attention to what's happening. And I think that's one of the other questions that was in the Q&A too, is that our community orgs being responsive to the kind of priorities they're seeing bubbling up from the ground. Welcome others' thoughts and perspectives on that. I'm seeing an updating of people's understanding and not just saying, let's just keep pushing the same policy solutions that we've been pushing for the last decade.
Thanks, Karthik. Any other panelists want to chime in on this question? Okay, very good. We'll keep it moving then. The next question is one that everyone's familiar with. We've been talking about the cuts at the federal level as far as public programs that millions and billions of dollars go to support communities of color, support the API community. Those cuts have been catastrophic in their impact. But let's talk about also the demand that's now placed on nonprofits such as NCAPA and our members. I'd love to invite Tu and Sina to provide their perspective. Both of your organizations are leading on many of these issues. None of us are immune to the funding cuts that we felt in philanthropy. What's your take on that question of how are we meeting the challenge of this moment when everything seems to be harder, there seems to be more to do, and there seems to be less resources to do it?
I can start. I think what we have witnessed and what we are experiencing right now is the trickle-down effect of federal cuts, because student organizations across the country are increasingly relying on OCA to support their student programming on college campuses, because college campuses are being impacted by federal cuts, by the anti-cultural programming, essentially. And we all know that these kind of student programs on college campuses are really critical for student success during their 4 years on a college campus. And so OCA has been increasingly funding more and more student organizations to do their programming. I think in terms of like what OCA is experiencing, I mean, we've just been having to really ramp up our individual donor cultivation and continue to have discussions, intimate discussions with our current funders about how we can both protect them and ourselves and continue impacting the work that honestly continues to be nonpartisan and impactful to all Americans?
Thanks for the question, Greg. That's a really good question because I feel like this keeps coming up time and time again. You know, at Epic, we're finding ourselves in many conversations with many community partners and organizations from across the country, from California to Utah to Arkansas to Washington State. Many of our own partners who once had funding for programs that they operate and serve NHPI communities in their respective communities no longer have those funds. So they're coming to us for support, to talk strategy, to talk ideas. So what we're doing on our end is we're doing what we can to not only support our our broader community, but making sure that we're supporting the people who actually do this work because it like I think Karthik said earlier, it's people just don't have the time to pay attention to this news. And so for many of our advocacy organizations, for our civic engagement organizations, we the fact that we get to do this is actually a privilege. And so seeing the trickle down of the impact from the federal level, we're seeing it firsthand in our communities and from our partners. That's definitely a big issue that's been coming up a lot.
Thanks, Sina. So I see that most of the questions have been answered. I'd love to see if any of our panelists have any final thoughts, maybe a 1 minute closeout remark. Karthik, I see you're off mute, so I'm going to pick on you first.
Oh, sorry, I did not mean to be off mute, but no, just so grateful for everyone's engagement, including webinar participants and those who have submitted their questions. It's heartening to me because so much of the news coverage and narrative do not include our communities. And that's really tragic. And including, as I started off saying, in a state like California, where we are not 5%, but 1 in 5. I mean, that's just blows my mind to see this level of selective attention and ignoring our community's needs and perspectives. So I do think it is in our hands and in our power to try and turn that dynamic around. So, but my call to action would be for each and every one of you to think about what are your spheres of influence, right? You are more powerful than you think, right? Or that you may believe or know. So how can you share this information? How can you make sure that you get in touch with your elected representatives, as well as parties and campaigns? There is no excuse to not invest in our communities. And we don't want it to be a self-defeating cycle in which people don't invest enough in programs in outreach, both on civic engagement as well as in terms of other programs and services, and then our communities essentially start withdrawing. That would be not only tragic for our communities, it would do real harm to America, where our communities are part of that story of America's strength. So that would be my call to action, Greg. We are using this hashtag Year of Action, and we mean it. We cannot take anything for granted. We know that, and we need to all lean in pretty heavily through the end of the year to make sure that our community's needs are recognized, respected, and prioritized.
Thanks, Karthik. Crystal, how about you? Any final thoughts?
Yeah, happy to share. I think during this time, it is so easy for us to feel like everything is on fire. Oh,
Crystal, thank you.
Realizing I was on mute. I think the one thing I'm thinking of is like do what you must to restore. Like during this time, there's so much to do. And you may feel like there's fires everywhere. But how are we leaning into and rooting ourselves and in our, communities and our connections with one another to know that we're doing this good work already. And so yeah, just appreciative of being able to hop on and share that a lot of the things that we're doing at NAPIMA. I think that I second Sina to when saying that we're figuring it out. We're figuring it out. We're coming together. We're co-resourcing. We're figuring out how to also just celebrate what has existed. Like tomorrow, I'm going to an AAPI celebration to really celebrate all the good work that the local AAPI has done over the past few years, and just being able to remind ourselves to do that as well.
Thanks, Crystal. Kelvin, how about you? Final word?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I'd say is there's a lot of really great data in here, so encourage folks to dig through it. And I would also say that I think the data is also pretty clear that there's with elections coming up in November. There's one party that our communities have trust in over another. But so it's really an opportunity in the fall for those folks to really continue keep the faith in that trust and really promise make good on that promise to do better on a lot of those issues. So yeah, thanks, Greg.
Thank you. Colm, how about you?
Yeah, I think the focus rightfully is on what's happening right now and the emergencies and struggles that our communities are facing. But I think it's important for us to remember that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And that while our communities are facing devastation right now, we have to think about what the solutions are in the mid to long term as well. How do we roll back all the harm that's been done? How do we bring back people who we love who've been deported and who we may never see again if we keep these same policies intact? So I think part of this is, let's look at the data, let's think about where our communities are now, but then let's also think about new ideas and really think about how we can politicize and make these concepts palpable because, this is a strange time for our communities. And certainly, it's also a time for members of Congress to embrace new ideas, new concepts, and think about how we can solve these problems in the future.
Thanks, Colm. And last but certainly not least, Mike, you want to come back?
Thanks, Greg. Just want to echo what this esteemed panel has all shared already, and I'll just add that this data is so wonderful. It is giving us the information and the tools we need to advocate for our communities. And when we do that work and we build these policy ideas and push our elected officials and policymakers to make changes on behalf of our communities, as an educator, I would say we also should be engaging with our young people and our students who oftentimes are our strongest voice and our most powerful voice. They are wonderful and amazing organizers and advocates. And so I encourage all of us as we engage in this collective work to make sure we include our students.
Thanks,
you.
Mike. And thank you to all of our panelists. It's been fantastic to hear from all of you. Again, special thanks to API Data for helping us get this survey off the ground and really produced, and then ultimately in the hands of all of you. In closing, I just want to say this. We are 2 days out from our Heritage Month, and it is a month in which there are more eyeballs on us. So let's take advantage, right? Use this data, use the stories of these organizations that are doing this work, as well as other NCAPA members. Force the conversation, right? Demand to be heard. And I think the survey data really allows us to have a credible leg to stand on to say this is what our community cares about. But look, Congress, local electeds, all these decision makers, they're not going to hear it unless we all step up and speak out. So that is my encouragement to all of you. The question in the chat about how are we engaging at the federal level? We're taking the survey data on the road. We'll be engaging with members of Congress, members of leadership, all throughout the month of May. You can do your part locally as well. And for those of you who are tuning in, catching the recording of this, if you have questions, if you have follow-up engagement that you'd like from any of the members or any of the panelists, please let us know. We'd be happy to connect. So thank you all for attending. Have a good day.